In the decades preceding the Second World War, Jewish life in Europe was a complex, vibrant tapestry deeply rooted in ancient traditions. Each community had its own rhythm, marked by festivals, prayers, sung languages, and the persistent memory of generations accustomed to surviving periods of prosperity and cyclical waves of hostility. Across the continent, from the shtetls of Poland and the Baltics to the bourgeois districts of Vienna or Berlin, European Judaism expressed itself in multiple and above all lively forms. In Warsaw, for example, a city where more than a third of the population was Jewish, the sound of Yiddish mixed with Polish was a natural part of the urban landscape. In Berlin, universities welcomed young Jewish students aspiring to become doctors, lawyers, or engineers. In Paris, Jewish intellectual life radiated from cafes and cultural circles where ideas on modernity, identity, and assimilation were debated. Many Jews identified deeply with their countries of residence. Cultural integration had progressed significantly in Western Germany since the late 19th century. There, Jewish families dominated banking, law, medicine, and the arts and had developed a strong German national identity. In France, after the trauma of the Dreyfus affair, the Third Republic worked to consolidate ideals of equality and citizenship, allowing more stable integration. Among Jews of Central and Western Europe, the belief prevailed that antisemitism, though persistent, was declining and belonged mostly to ultra-conservative sectors without real influence on modern politics. Eastern Europe, however, showed different nuances. Regions such as Poland, Romania, or Ukraine hosted huge, diverse, and often poor Jewish communities. The shtetls, small towns where religious life was the core of existence, preserved traditions that would be almost completely destroyed years later. In these environments lived learned rabbis, merchants, artisans, tanners, printers, tailors, and teachers who devoted their lives to Talmudic study or to maintaining communal activities. Synagogues were the heart of the town, and daily life unfolded among fairs, markets, small disputes, joyful weddings, and a profound sense of solidarity. In larger cities such as Łódź or Krakow, the Jewish community was divided among a working class linked to the textile industry, a growing commercial bourgeoisie, and an intellectual elite actively involved in national politics. Zionist, socialist, and religious parties debated different visions of the future. Some supported full integration into modern states, others advocated emigration to Palestine, others, more traditional, believed in preserving communal life as it had existed for centuries. This variety of perspectives produced a unique cultural ecosystem, mixing modernizing openness with the strength of ancient customs. Despite progress in many regions, tension remained constant. In various parts of Eastern Europe, pogroms inherited from the 19th century persisted, reigniting whenever economic or political conditions became critical. Countries like Romania experienced waves of violence and discrimination fueled by ultra-nationalist movements. In Poland, economic and political competition between Catholic and Jewish sectors provoked protests, commercial boycotts, and restrictions on Jewish university students. These episodes, though isolated, marked the collective memory. They warned that stability could collapse overnight. In Germany, meanwhile, resentment born from the Treaty of Versailles fed discourses portraying Jews as responsible for defeat and economic crisis. Although this view was not widespread before 1933, it had powerful representatives in extremist parties that used incendiary language. Even so, many German Jewish families felt safe, trusted Republican institutions, and could not imagine that this marginal anti-Semitism would become state policy. Jewish culture flourished on all fronts. Yiddish literature experienced a golden age with authors such as Sholem Aleichem, whose stories about life in the shtetls resonated with readers in many countries. Jewish theatre was an artistic force traveling from Vilna to New York, with companies performing dramas, satires, and historical works. In the religious sphere, Hasidism maintained deep influence, especially in Poland and Hungary, where Rebs exercised moral and spiritual leadership. At the same time, reformist and liberal movements created new interpretations of religious practice, particularly in Germany and Austria, where synagogues introduced modern music and sermons in the vernacular. Jewish life was also shaped by internal tensions. Some young people felt that the traditional model had stagnated in the face of modern demands. New generations, influenced by socialism and labor movements, sought an identity that was more political than religious. By contrast, Orthodox groups viewed rapid modernization and the risk of assimilation with concern. These debates grew intense in community meetings, newspapers, and in the streets, creating a vibrant atmosphere characteristic of major cities with Jewish populations. Economic conditions varied greatly by region. In Vienna, before the Nazi annexation, Jews held key positions in medicine, publishing, and music. In Berlin, they were prominent in cabarets, cinema, and architecture. In Eastern Europe, however, much of the Jewish population survived on modest trades. Even so, education was a central value everywhere, even in the poorest areas. Jewish schools, both religious and secular, formed a literate generation with a strong cultural identity expressed through study, music, and communal life. All of this coexisted with a quiet detail, a growing sense of vulnerability, especially among those who followed European politics closely. The nationalist discourses spreading through Germany, Italy, and parts of Eastern Europe contained antisemitism that became increasingly explicit. Despite this, few imagined the magnitude of the coming catastrophe. Most believed their lives would continue as always, through ups and downs, negotiations with local authorities, and the enduring adaptability that had characterized European Judaism for centuries. In 1933, Adolf Hitler's rise to power caused concern, but not immediate panic. Many Jewish community leaders in Germany believed the new government would toughen policies, but that the institutions of the rule of law would limit any excess. No one yet foresaw that old tensions, nationalist resentments, and conspiracy theories would turn into a systematic persecution program. The rise of Nazi antisemitism. When Adolf Hitler assumed power in January 1933, the antisemitism that for decades had been a loud but marginal current in Germany suddenly became the official doctrine of the state. For millions of European Jews, especially those living in territories under German influence, this shift marked the beginning of a profound and meticulously engineered transformation of daily life. What had previously been insults, offensive caricatures, or occasional discrimination turned into a legal, political, and social machinery designed to expel, degrade, and isolate them step by step. From the first day, the Nazi regime understood that exclusion had to be built with an appearance of legitimacy, using laws, decrees, and propaganda to normalize persecution and turn it into a habit within German society. The process was immediate and systematic. Only weeks after Hitler's rise to power, the new government launched the national boycott of Jewish businesses, presented as an act of defense against alleged international conspiracies. SA members stood in front of shops, medical offices, and law firms, painting Stars of David and threatening slogans. Although the boycott lasted only one day, it marked a turning point. The state had publicly declared that Jews were an internal enemy. It was the first step in a mechanism that would close around them with calculated precision. Beginning in 1933, the regime enacted laws aimed at removing Jews from professional life. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service expelled thousands of teachers, university professors, judges, and state employees. Jewish doctors lost their licenses, lawyers were disqualified from courts, and artists saw their work removed from museums and theaters. Professional exclusion not only impoverished tens of thousands of families, it destroyed entire social structures, eroded communal bonds, and delivered an unequivocal message of marginalization. In parallel, Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, turned anti-Semitism into an everyday element. Films, newsreels, newspapers, and radio endlessly repeated the idea that Jews were responsible for the economic, moral, and cultural decline of the country. Magazines like Der Stürmer flooded the streets with grotesque caricatures, reinforcing medieval and pseudo-scientific stereotypes. This propaganda was not meant merely to persuade, it was meant to saturate. Constant repetition turned lies into a mental landscape from which the German population could hardly escape. Science was also co-opted to reinforce this narrative. Pseudo-biological theories of racial purity gained ground in universities and research centers. Lectures on racial hygiene multiplied, and concepts such as German blood and Aryan race became official state categories. The goal was to create an intellectual framework that validated exclusion so that the population perceived it not as hatred, but as a necessary policy to preserve the country's health. Between 1933 and 1935, this ideological construction prepared the ground for a qualitative leap. On September 15, 1935, during the Nuremberg Party rally, the regime enacted two fundamental decrees: the Reich citizenship law and the law for the protection of German blood and honor. With them, Jews ceased to be German citizens and were forbidden to marry or have relations with persons considered of German blood. More importantly, the state legally defined who was Jewish, not by religion, but by family ancestry. This change was devastating. It turned Jewish identity into a legal mark that could not be altered by conversion, integration, or patriotism. Jewishness became an inherited and unchangeable condition. After Nuremberg, restrictions multiplied: expulsions from public schools, sports bans, business limitations, confiscation of property, movement restrictions, and administrative markings. Each measure was introduced alongside propaganda intended to convince the population that such exclusion was necessary to protect Germany. Anti-Semitism became not only state policy, but a social mandate that resonated with sectors that viewed Jews as convenient scapegoats in times of crisis. In Austria, the situation worsened with the annexation of 1938. After the Anschluss, public humiliations were brutal. Jews forced to clean streets on their knees, shops looted, and synagogues destroyed by mobs encouraged by Nazi authorities. The violence was immediate, spontaneous, and deeply symbolic. Austria demonstrated to the Reich how quickly hatred could spread when authority validated it. Thousands of Jewish families desperately sought visas to emigrate, but the world, caught between economic crises and political fears, closed its doors one after another. The Evian Conference, held that same year, made clear that the international community was unwilling to accept a massive influx of Jewish refugees. The combination of legal exclusion, constant propaganda, and public humiliation shattered the last hopes of those who still believed hostility was temporary. Each week seemed to establish a new rule, erase a right and narrow the margin for survival. By 1938, Jews lived in a state of legal suffocation, confined between economic restrictions and a poisoned social climate that normalized violence. Many still tried to maintain routines: improvised schools, community activities, mutual aid. But the country they had known, one of imperfect coexistence, gradual integration, and shared citizenship, had vanished under the weight of an ideology that considered them a biological danger. Radicalization intensified throughout the year. The speeches of Hitler and Goebbels openly discussed expulsion, isolation, and solutions to the Jewish question. In the streets, the SA and the Gestapo acted with growing impunity. Small acts of violence became routine, and Jews were beaten, detained, or robbed of their belongings without any possibility of justice. The population, exposed to years of propaganda, oscillated between indifference, fear, and, in some cases, active complicity. By the end of 1938, the situation reached a boiling point. The combination of extremist ideology, social resentment, and a state apparatus ready to act culminated in the first massive and coordinated outbreak of violence by the Nazi regime against the Jews of 1938 Germany and Austria. A night of fire, shattered glass, and destruction marked the end of the illusion that the persecution could be stopped and opened the door to an even darker phase of the Nazi project. Kristallnacht, 1938. On the night of November 9, 1938, an unusual silence settled over German cities. At first glance, nothing suggested that within a few hours this silence would be replaced by the simultaneous shattering of thousands of windows, the smoke of burning synagogues, and the screams of Jewish families awakened by pounding on their doors. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, was not a spontaneous outburst of popular anger as Nazi propaganda claimed the following day. It was an organized, encouraged, and coordinated attack by the regime, combining street violence with public humiliation and the methodical destruction of every visible trace of Jewish life in Germany and Austria. The official trigger was the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris, Ernst vom Rath, by a desperate young Polish Jew whose family had been expelled. The Nazis used the incident as the perfect pretext. Joseph Goebbels, aware of the political opportunity, delivered an incendiary speech to party members and ordered that the indignation be expressed immediately. But this indignation did not come from the civilian population. It came from the SA, SS, Gestapo, and organized groups who received precise instructions. The violence was planned, although presented as an emotional outburst. the first synagogues began to burn as night fell. In Munich, Berlin, Hamburg, Vienna, and more than 1,000 towns, Nazi commandos forced their way into buildings, smashed windows, dragged Torah scrolls into the streets and set them on fire. The religious buildings, often constructed through the great effort of centuries-old communities, became bonfires visible for miles. Firefighters appeared in multiple locations, but they had orders: intervene only to protect adjacent Aryan property, not to save synagogues. The message was clear: this destruction was permitted, legitimized, and celebrated. The streets filled with broken glass, smashed furniture, and merchandise scattered across the ground. Jewish shops, medical offices, and businesses were looted simultaneously. The attackers moved without hurry, knowing no one would stop them. Entire families were driven from their homes during the night, forced to watch as strangers destroyed possessions accumulated over a lifetime. Many were beaten in front of their neighbors, forced to clear debris, or dragged away by the Gestapo. The climate of terror advanced from house to house. In Berlin, more than 40 synagogues were attacked. In Vienna, the violence took on almost ritual dimensions. Jews were forced to kneel and pray while crowds insulted and beat them. In smaller towns where everyone knew each other, the brutality took on an even more sinister tone. Former customers and co-workers watched in silence or with complicity as their Jewish neighbors were stripped of everything. The violence was not limited to material destruction. Between 30,000 and 35,000 Jewish men were arrested within hours and sent to concentration camps such as Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. Many were not accused of any crime. Their arrest was collective punishment and a message of terror. For days they were subjected to torture, forced labor, and humiliation. To secure their release, many families had to sign documents consenting to the forced sale of their businesses, homes, and property at absurdly low prices. Kristallnacht was not only physical violence, it was a carefully integrated process of economic plunder. The international reaction was one of indignation, but it produced no significant changes. Countries such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and France condemned the events, but maintained restrictive immigration policies for Jewish refugees. The international community watched with horror, but without decisive action, as a modern European state unleashed open persecution against hundreds of thousands of people marked as enemies because of their origin. For many German Jews, this was the moment when the hope that state institutions could stop Nazi radicalization collapsed. That night made it clear that the persecution was no longer a gradual campaign. It had entered an openly violent phase. Following the attack, the Nazi regime deepened exclusion with new legal measures. Jews were required to pay a collective contribution of 1 billion Reichsmarks as compensation for the damages caused by their own attackers. They were forbidden to attend public schools, use transportation, visit theaters, or own businesses. Before Kristallnacht, some still hoped to withstand the storm. After it, everything became urgent. Emigration became a race against time, but obtaining visas was nearly impossible. For many survivors, the memory of that night remained the moment when their country, where they had been born, educated, worked, and raised their children, revealed itself as a mortal threat. The crunching of broken glass, the fires illuminating dark streets, and the screams echoing under an indifferent sky became symbols of a new stage. Violence was no longer a prelude, but the announcement of something far more terrible. While the smoke from the synagogue still hung in the air, the Nazi regime began consolidating a new strategy to manage the Jewish presence in occupied territories. This next step, seemingly administrative, would transform entire cities into spaces of confinement and total control. Here began the era of the ghettos. The creation of the ghettos. When the German invasion of Poland began on September 1, 1939, millions of Jews were trapped in a territory that soon became the central laboratory of the Reich's anti-Semitic policy. The idea of separating them from the rest of the population, presented by the Nazis as a security and sanitary measure, was in reality a necessary preliminary step for future physical elimination. The creation of the ghettos was not improvised. It was the result of calculated, studied, and administratively endorsed decisions aimed at transforming entire cities into spaces of isolation, suffering, and slow death. The orders were first implemented in the Polish territories directly annexed to the Reich and shortly thereafter in the general government, a vast region administered as a German colony. There, civilian and military authorities began clearing whole neighborhoods to concentrate Jews in limited areas, often old, deteriorated residential zones. The logic was simple and cruel. Imprison hundreds of thousands of people in confined spaces, reduce their access to food, work, and housing, and let them survive as they could while the Nazi machinery developed more definitive plans. The Łódź Ghetto, one of the first and strictest, was sealed in April 1940. More than 160,000 Jews were trapped within a maze of narrow streets, fenced with barbed wire and guarded by armed patrols. The gates were controlled by German police and a Jewish auxiliary force forced to obey impossible orders. Hunger set in within weeks. The official rations were so limited that thousands depended on smuggling, which in turn was punished with summary executions. The factories installed inside the ghetto, turned into forced labor workshops, were presented as a chance for survival, but also served to exploit labor under inhuman conditions. In Warsaw, where more than 350,000 Jews had lived before the war, the situation reached colossal dimensions. The ghetto was formally established in November 1940, becoming the largest confinement space in modern history. Wall by wall, stone by stone, the Nazis erected a physical barrier that not only divided the city, but silently transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Inside the ghetto, human density reached unthinkable levels, up to 9 people per room. The streets were crowded with street vendors, children searching for food, and elderly people walking slowly in search of help. Despite everything, life attempted to persist. Secret schools, improvised libraries, clandestine theater performances, and networks of solidarity emerged to balance the impossible, surviving in a space designed to extinguish them. The Krakow ghetto was smaller but no less oppressive. There, the Germans expelled thousands of Jews from their homes in the historic city center and relocated them to an isolated neighborhood across the Vistula River. Material conditions were poor and hunger constant, but small pockets of cultural resistance also emerged. Rabbis who organized secret study groups, doctors who, without medicine, tried to stop epidemics with knowledge and discipline, and families who celebrated holidays with the little they could preserve. The administrative process that created these ghettos was as rigid as it was dehumanizing. Every Jew had to identify themselves with a yellow star sewn onto their clothing. They had to register their possessions, report changes of residence, and comply with strict curfews. The confinement was accompanied by total economic control. The Nazis seized businesses, confiscated property, and supervised every commercial activity. The goal was to remove autonomy, destroy dignity, and turn Jewish communities into a mass completely dependent on German decisions. At the same time, the ghettos became spaces where Jewish leadership, organized in the Judenräte, mandatory councils imposed by the Nazis, had to face impossible decisions. These councils administered food, work, housing, and health under conditions of brutal scarcity. Their members lived trapped between the harsh demands of German authorities and the desperation of their own people, aware that any unfulfilled order could trigger collective punishments. There was no room for pure ethics in a system designed to erode morality from within. Hunger was, from the beginning, a weapon of war. Official rations in Warsaw amounted to about 184 calories per day for Jews, an amount insufficient to keep an adult standing. Widespread malnutrition made diseases such as typhus and tuberculosis endemic. Weakened bodies, extremely thin children, elderly people collapsing in the streets. Everyday life in a ghetto was a succession of heavy silences, endless lines, and a constant struggle to obtain the most basic necessities. Despite this, cultural life persisted. In Warsaw, poets and musicians continued creating works that circulated secretly. Clandestine diaries were organized to document daily life, knowing that one day the world would need evidence. The secret Oneg Shabbat archive, led by Emanuel Ringelblum, gathered thousands of documents, letters, children's drawings, and testimonies that would survive to tell the story from within. The preservation of memory became an act of resistance. Each ghetto developed its own rhythm, its own pain, and its own way of holding on to life. But all shared the same destiny. They were designed to be temporary. The Nazis never intended them as permanent spaces, but as places to concentrate entire populations until their final fate was determined. That fate began to take shape in 1941, when the German invasion of the Soviet Union further radicalized anti-Semitic policy and turned confinement into a deadly prelude. The Wannsee Conference. On the morning of January 20th, 1942, frost covered the shores of Lake Wannsee on the outskirts of Berlin. The villa where the meeting would take place appeared calm, almost idyllic. From the outside, no one would have suspected that behind its windows decisions would be made that would seal the fate of millions of human beings. Amid cups of coffee, cigarettes, and calculated administrative language, high officials of the Third Reich coordinated the logistics of the most systematic crime in modern history. The Wannsee Conference was not the origin of the genocide, but it was the moment when the killing machinery became organized, standardized, and approved by the main institutions of the German state. The meeting, convened by Reinhard Heydrich, who served as chief of the Reich Main Security Office, had a clear objective: to secure the cooperation of the various ministries and agencies in implementing the so-called final solution to the Jewish question. That cold and deceptive term had been circulating among senior Nazi leaders for months, but in Wannsee it acquired a concrete meaning: industrial murder, mass deportations, extermination camps, and the complete elimination of Jewish life in Europe. The purpose was not to debate whether they should do it, but how to do it efficiently. The main document presented by Heydrich listed approximately 11 million Jews living in European territories or under German influence. The precision of the figures revealed the scope of the plan, from Jews in the Reich to those in Spain, Britain, Switzerland, the Balkans, the Soviet Union, and Turkey. Every community, regardless of size or level of integration, was included in the extermination projection. The terminology used, such as evacuation, special treatment, or work under supervision, was made up of euphemisms designed to conceal the real brutality of the project. Heydrich explained that the war had created a historic opportunity to carry out the final solution. The massive displacement of population, administrative chaos in occupied territories, and total control over Poland and Eastern Europe would facilitate the implementation of extreme measures. The plan envisioned transporting Jews from every corner of Europe to the east, where they would first be subjected to forced labor. After the inevitable natural mortality through exhaustion and starvation, the survivors, considered by the Nazis to be the most resistant, would be systematically killed. The coldness with which these points were discussed struck those who studied the document decades later. Wannsee was not an emotional outburst of hatred, but a session of public administration. Those present, representatives from ministries such as Justice, Interior, Transport, and Foreign Affairs, took notes, corrected details, and raised logistical questions. The disagreements were not about the morality of the plan, since no one questioned the genocide, but about jurisdiction, legal competencies, and administrative procedures. The tone was one of efficiency, not violence. This normalization of mass murder was one of the most chilling aspects of the meeting. One of the tensest points emerged when discussing who should be considered Jewish. The Nuremberg laws had established categories based on family ancestry, but there were complex cases: mixed marriages, converts, decorated war veterans. For those present, these ambiguities represented bureaucratic obstacles that needed to be resolved so that the deportation could be complete. Heydrich's response was blunt: any biological connection, however minimal, should be included as a criterion for elimination. The attendees accepted the statement without objection. Another crucial aspect of the meeting was the need to coordinate railway transport. Industrial murder could not be carried out without an efficient train system capable of moving millions of people to the extermination centers. The Ministry of Transport, represented at Wannsee, assumed that responsibility with disturbing efficiency: schedules, routes, wagon availability, military priorities. Everything was part of the calculations needed for the genocide to advance without interruption. The conference also explicitly mentioned the extermination camps that were already operating or being expanded, such as Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, where gas would become the primary method for killing large numbers of people within minutes. Wannsee did not invent these camps, but it incorporated them into a centralized structure that allowed their scale to multiply. The meeting lasted barely an hour and a half. When it ended, the participants exchanged polite farewells, made trivial comments, and returned to their offices. None had held a weapon or witnessed an execution that day, but all had contributed to designing the system that would lead to the deaths of millions. This contrast between the appearance of administrative normality and the brutality of the purpose is one of the reasons why Wannsee remains a dark symbol of modernity in the service of extermination. The final report, drafted by Adolf Eichmann, used technical language that diluted the real violence hidden behind bureaucratic expressions. Only decades later, when copy number 16 of the protocol was recovered, could the world clearly see how the document that ordered the final phase of the genocide had been formulated. Every sentence was another component in a mechanism designed to eliminate, without exception, the Jews of Europe. After the conference, the steps accelerated. Deportations intensified immediately. Overcrowded trains left large and small cities every day, and the ghettos, weakened by hunger and disease, became waiting stations for a much worse fate. Wannsee had provided the missing coordination, allowing the final solution to move from theory to mass murder. As the wagons were prepared and railway routes adjusted to absorb the human flow, millions of Jews in Europe, unaware of the content of that secret meeting, began to see their ghettos emptied, their streets filled with soldiers, and the word relocation transformed into an irreversible sentence that would culminate in the trains now departing with no return toward the extermination camps. The deportations to the extermination camps from 1942 onward. At the beginning of 1942, while snow covered tracks, stations and rooftops across much of Europe, trains began to turn into the main instrument of genocide. For millions of Jews, the metallic sound of an approaching convoy no longer meant transport or commerce, but a dark destination from which no one returned. After the Wannsee Conference, mass deportations ceased to be isolated episodes and became a systematic policy, coordinated and carried out with relentless precision. The Reich Railway Administration became a central part of the crime. Organized schedules, defined routes and freight trains assigned exclusively to the daily transfer of human beings to the extermination camps. The ghettos, already weakened by hunger, disease and isolation, entered a period of progressive liquidation. In Warsaw, the first deportations began in July 1942. The Germans announced that the Jews would be resettled in the East for work, but the word work was a cruel disguise. Streets were filled with posters ordering people to report for transport, and anyone who disobeyed faced immediate arrest or execution. Every morning, massive columns of people were marched to the Umschlagplatz, the transfer square where they boarded cattle wagons bound for Treblinka. Tens of thousands disappeared within weeks. In Łódź, the process was administered with extreme bureaucratic coldness. The ghetto, transformed into a complex of forced labor workshops, remained active longer because it produced uniforms, shoes and equipment for the German army. However, even that economic value did not protect its population. Starting in 1942, the trains began to take the elderly and sick first, then the children, during a particularly traumatic operation known as the Speer, and finally entire families. Every announcement of a new deportation generated scenes of despair, parents hiding their children in basements, elderly people begging to be left behind, mothers offering valuables to bribe guards. Nothing stopped the process. The freight wagons, designed to transport animals or goods, became mobile chambers of suffering. In a single wagon, between 70 and 100 people could be crammed in, with no seats, no water, and only a small opening for air. The doors were locked from the outside with metal bolts, and once inside, the world was reduced to the smell of fear, the press of bodies, and the creaking of wood under the movement of the train. Many died before reaching their destination: asphyxiation, dehydration, heart attacks. Those who survived did so in a state of extreme exhaustion. Deportations were not limited to Poland. In France, the police actively collaborated in the arrest of foreign and French Jews. The Veldiv roundup in July 1942 turned a sports stadium into a massive confinement space where thousands of people were packed together without ventilation or drinking water for days before being sent to Auschwitz. In the Netherlands, deportation began at Westerbork, a transit camp where families sometimes waited for weeks for the train that would take them east. In Slovakia, Hungary, Belgium and Greece, trains also filled with entire communities torn from their homes. The logistics of the crime required constant coordination. The Reichsbahn charged fees per transported person as if it were just another commercial service. Administrative offices calculated costs, schedules, and wagon availability. Daily reports recorded how many Jews had been sent, how many had died en route, and how many had arrived. Dehumanization was total. Each individual was reduced to a number on a list, a figure in a bureaucratic report. Psychological terror was as devastating as physical suffering. No one knew exactly what happened in the extermination camps, but rumors grew. Stories circulated in the ghettos about people disappearing, about trains that left and never returned. Some spoke of deadly showers, pits, constant smoke in the forests. Although many refused to believe it, the intuition that resettlement hid something irreparable grew stronger. Even so, the deception persisted. The Germans ordered deportees to bring luggage, documents, utensils, as if a new life awaited them. This pretense kept order until the very last moment. One of the most disturbing cases was that of Hungary. In 1944, within just 8 weeks, around 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz in one of the fastest and largest operations of the entire Holocaust. Entire trains arrived every day, filled almost exclusively with complete families, many of whom had not previously experienced the systematic violence that had devastated Poland. The tracks never rested. It was a constant, almost industrial flow. The end of the journey was always the same: a platform, blinding lights, shouting in German, barking dogs, abrupt orders. The deportees stumbled out, disoriented after days in darkness. There began the selection, men and women separated, the young pulled away from the elderly, parents torn from their children. Most did not know that that instant, just seconds after touching the ground, determined whether they would continue living or be sent directly to their deaths. Every train that left a ghetto, a transit camp, or an occupied city was a silent farewell. For the Jewish communities of Europe, the deportations were the moment when collective life, built over centuries, began to disappear irreversibly. Entire families vanished without a trace, and the streets that had witnessed rituals, celebrations, and daily routines suddenly became empty, as if a dark wind had erased history. Upon arrival, the deportees entered a world designed specifically for death. There began the most brutal phase of the genocide, a calculated system that turned entire cities, forests, and plains of Eastern Europe into scenes of organized extermination, whose epicenter was Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and other camps where death became a daily routine. The extermination camps. When the Nazi regime began consolidating power in 1933, its repressive apparatus had not yet taken the industrialized and lethal form it would later acquire. However, during those early years, it began establishing facilities that would function as laboratories of terror. The early concentration camps, places where methods of control, discipline, punishment, and dehumanization were perfected and later applied on a continental scale. To understand the evolution of Nazi violence, it is necessary to examine these initial spaces: Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, and other camps where brutality was not yet an end in itself, but already served as a daily tool of domination. Jewish life, which at that time had not yet been formally condemned to extermination, began there to be shaped by a system whose explicit purpose was to destroy human dignity. The first permanent camp, founded only weeks after Hitler took power, was Dachau, established near Munich in March 1933. Its creation was announced in newspapers as a necessary measure to protect the German people from Marxism, criminality, and the alleged internal threat posed by socialists, communists, and political opponents. But very soon, without formal announcements, Jews also began to be sent there. Dachau became the organizational model for all later camps: a rigid hierarchical structure, commanders with absolute power, guards trained to exercise arbitrary violence, and an internal system that humiliated prisoners without pause. The instruction that Theodor Eicke gave to the SS was clear: prisoners had no rights. Their existence depended solely on the will of the guard standing before them. Entering Dachau meant undergoing a ritual of dispossession. Upon arrival, prisoners were forced to undress in front of everyone, shaved, beaten, insulted, and then dressed in coarse uniforms that replaced their identity with a number. This process, which would later be repeated millions of times across Europe, was already a declaration of intent. The camp was meant to break body, mind, and spirit. It was not yet about extermination, but about accustoming men and women to a world where violence was the norm and where the state could shape existence in detail. In Sachsenhausen, inaugurated in 1936, a few kilometers from Berlin, the architecture itself was designed to test surveillance efficiency. From a central tower, guards could see every barracks and every movement, creating a constant presence that eliminated any sense of privacy or refuge. There, techniques of extreme forced labor were tested. Prisoners were forced to walk for hours on a test track to evaluate the quality of military boots. Others were assigned to workshops where production was combined with physical punishment. For Jews, the treatment was even more degrading. They were assigned to clean latrines, carry heavy materials, or sort garbage. Even before Nazi ideology established extermination as a final goal, it was already clear that Jews were being singled out for a harsher fate. In Buchenwald, near Weimar, terror took on more subtle but equally devastating forms. Workshops were created that supplied the regime, carpentry, blacksmithing, light weapons factories. Jewish prisoners were forced to work endless shifts, weakening until they became unrecognizable. Those who collapsed were beaten or sent to barracks where diseases spread uncontrollably. Hunger was constant. Rations barely kept those who received them alive. Many survivors recalled that obsessive thoughts about food haunted them day and night, replacing any other human need. By the late 1930s, these camps began receiving thousands of Jews following specific political events. During Kristallnacht, more than 30,000 were arrested and sent to Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald. For many, this was the first warning that the regime was willing to use its terror infrastructure directly and massively against them. Most were released weeks later, but not without a fundamental consequence. They had to sign documents committing to emigrate from Germany, renounce property, and even accept forced sales of belongings. These camps thus became not only places of punishment, but also instruments of extortion that forced Jews to leave the country under threat of death. Punishments in the early camps took forms that would later be replicated across Europe. One of the most feared was the hanging tree. Prisoners were suspended by arms tied behind their backs, causing dislocations and unbearable pain. Others were forced to remain for hours in a crouched position, and those who fell were beaten mercilessly. Violence functioned as discipline, demonstrating to each prisoner that their life had no value and that total obedience was the only way to survive. Despite the terror, Jewish communities within the camps attempted to preserve fragments of humanity. Some rabbis whispered prayers at night. Basic hygiene rules were shared to prevent disease. At times, stronger prisoners helped the weakened so they would not be selected during roll calls that could mean death. Every act of solidarity was a challenge to the system that sought to reduce them to isolated and resigned beings. The administrative structure of these early camps also revealed an unsettling intention. Precise records were kept, deaths were counted, prisoners were classified by racial and political categories. This bureaucratic order foreshadowed a terrible evolution, a state apparatus capable of applying terror with mathematical precision. By the late 1930s, concentration camps were already an essential component of the Nazi regime. But a decisive step was still missing: transforming these centers of torture and forced labor into mechanisms of extermination. This leap, which would make Dachau, Sachsenhausen, or Buchenwald mere prototypes of something far more lethal, came with Germany's territorial expansion and the formal implementation of the final solution. And this new system would have a name that would forever resonate in Jewish memory: Auschwitz-Birkenau. When the German occupation of Poland began in 1939, the regime had already perfected the foundations of terror in the early camps, but there was still no structure designed exclusively to kill on a continental scale. That void was soon filled. The combination of territorial control, radicalized racial ideology, and bureaucratic planning led to the creation of a network of concentration and extermination camps where forced labor and industrial murder coexisted as components of the same program. At the center of this system would be Auschwitz-Birkenau, a place so vast, so complex, and so deadly that it became the ultimate symbol of the Jewish genocide. Auschwitz began as a concentration camp in 1940, built on a former military barracks in the region of Oświęcim in Poland. Its initial function was to house Polish political prisoners, but its location, near strategic railway lines and surrounded by rural areas easy to control, made it an ideal candidate to become something much larger. When Himmler visited the area, he recognized potential that would change history. In Auschwitz, massive forced labor and at the same time extermination facilities hidden in vast zones could coexist. It was the perfect terrain for transforming the theory of the final solution into a functioning mechanism. In 1941, expansion toward Birkenau began, also known as Auschwitz-II, a gigantic complex with barracks for tens of thousands of prisoners, multiplied surveillance systems, separate administrative zones, and the necessary infrastructure to receive trains from all over Europe. Its internal platforms, designed to allow trains to enter directly into the heart of the camp, revealed the site's purpose: to be a terminal station from which most deportees would never see daylight again. The typical scene in Birkenau repeated itself thousands of times within weeks. The trains stopped, the doors opened with a harsh metallic blow, and prisoners were pushed out amid shouting, barking dogs and blows. Many could barely stand after days locked inside cattle cars without water or ventilation. SS guards issued rapid orders while women, men, the elderly and children instinctively grouped together. In minutes, a line formed for selection, the fit for work to one side, the rest to the other. That simple gesture, a raised hand, a finger pointing left or right, determined life or death. The majority were sent directly to the gas chambers. These installations were disguised as communal baths, with fake signs indicating showers and disinfection rooms. Prisoners had to leave their belongings on numbered hooks to simulate a return that would never occur. Inside, the space was sealed airtight and Zyklon B pellets were thrown in, a pesticide that released hydrogen cyanide upon contact with air. In less than 20 minutes, hundreds died trapped in brutal silence. Then came the Sonderkommandos, Jewish prisoners forced to remove the bodies, extract gold teeth, cut hair, and load the corpses into the crematoria. It was the most painful task in the camp, and those who carried it out lived knowing they would eventually be executed to eliminate witnesses. Their testimonies, hidden, buried, and eventually recovered after the war, are among the most heartbreaking documents about the machinery of extermination. The crematoria operated 24 hours a day. At peak activity, Birkenau could eliminate thousands of bodies per day, and when the ovens could not keep up, open-air burning pits were used. The smoke was so constant that prisoners said the sky seemed never to change. For those selected for forced labor, the torment followed another rhythm. The barracks were overcrowded, with wooden bunks that held up to 8 people per level. Diseases such as typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis posed a constant threat. Food consisted of watery soup filled with scraps, hard bread, and a coffee substitute that barely warmed the hands. Many prisoners lost their strength within weeks. Forced labor was carried out under constant surveillance. Auschwitz housed factories linked to IG Farben, where thousands of Jews produced synthetic rubber, chemicals, or construction materials. Others were sent to quarries, ditches, workshops, depots, or roads. Each task drained body and morale, and guards beat or executed without warning anyone who moved slowly or appeared to falter. Between forced labor and selections, surviving required a combination of physical endurance, luck, and mutual assistance. Prisoners shared pieces of bread, warned each other about surprise inspections, or hid the sick to prevent them from being sent to the gas chambers. Solidarity, though difficult, became one of the few resources sustaining the will to stay alive. Despite the absolute horror, there were extraordinary acts of internal resistance. In October 1944, the Sonderkommandos managed to blow up Crematorium 4 using gunpowder smuggled by female prisoners who worked in nearby factories. It was a heroic act that demonstrated that even in the heart of extermination, a spark of rebellion persisted that the Nazis could not completely extinguish. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not the only hybrid camp of concentration and extermination, but it was the largest, deadliest, and most symbolic. Others, like Majdanek, Mauthausen, or Ravensbrück, combined forced labor with systematic executions, but none matched the industrial scale of the complex at Auschwitz. During its most active period, Auschwitz killed more than 10,000 people per day. Daily life in the camps. In the early concentration camps, daily life was organized as a machinery of physical and psychological exhaustion. Although these camps had not yet adopted the systematic extermination policy that would dominate from 1940 onward, they already functioned as zones of slow destruction, where extreme discipline, exhausting labor, and arbitrary violence shaped the prisoners' everyday routines. From dawn until night, the goal was to break the will, erase identity, and prepare the ground for an even more radical form of oppression. The day began before sunrise. A whistle, a shout, or the dry sound of a baton hitting a door woke the prisoners, who had to get up immediately, even if the cold froze their breath or the darkness was almost total. The barracks were rigid, poorly ventilated, and overcrowded. Rows of wooden bunks where men or women slept packed together with rough blankets and bodies that could barely stretch. Lice, fleas, and the penetrating smell of sweat mixed with moisture covered every surface. After getting up, the prisoners ran, literally, to the Appellplatz, the square where roll call was conducted. This ritual, inherited from military practices but deformed by sadism, could last minutes or hours, depending on the weather or the mood of the officer in charge. If someone failed to appear, everyone had to remain motionless until the body was found. If a prisoner collapsed from exhaustion, others had to hold them up to avoid collective punishment. The discipline of roll call foreshadowed what the rest of the day would be, a constant balance between obedience, fear, and survival. After roll call came breakfast, which did not deserve the name. A cup of hot liquid barely worthy of being called coffee, accompanied by a piece of hard bread that every prisoner had to ration if they wanted to avoid fainting halfway through the day. Eating too fast meant hunger hours later. Eating too slowly could mean losing the ration due to a sudden blow from a guard. The rules were invisible but clear. Any mistake was punished. Forced labor began immediately. Each camp had its own system, but the goal was identical: to exploit weakened bodies as much as possible. In Dachau, many prisoners were sent to workshops, improvised factories, or construction areas. In Sachsenhausen, the test track where prisoners walked for hours without rest became a symbol of endless exhaustion. In Buchenwald, the quarries and SS workshops were spaces where productivity was secondary to physical punishment. Work was organized into strict groups, supervised by armed guards or privileged prisoners assigned to maintain order. The tasks were exhausting: carrying stones, digging ditches, transporting beams, cleaning sewers, building barracks, moving heavy machinery. The purpose was not to produce, but to slowly destroy every muscle and every illusion of resistance. Prisoners knew they had to maintain a constant pace to avoid unexpected blows. Every movement was watched. Violence was not an accident. It was the central mechanism. Blows with batons, kicks, beatings in front of everyone, punishment exercises such as repeated jumping, crawling over gravel, or remaining in painful positions for hours. Collective punishments were frequent. An individual error could cause an entire barrack to spend the night standing or rations to be reduced for days. Progressive torture began this way, not as an isolated act, but as a system that infiltrated every aspect of life. At noon, the watery soup, which did not provide enough calories for an adult, was the only break. Many prisoners ate quickly, fearing the food would run out before their turn. Others tried to save some for later, although this reserve almost never relieved the perpetual hunger. Malnutrition left everyone vulnerable. Legs that no longer responded, fingers turning blue, wounds that would not heal, infections spreading without treatment. Work continued until sunset. On cold days, the wind cut into the skin. On hot days, the sun caused prisoners to faint. Guards used any excuse to unleash blows: a dropped tool, a wrong look, a slow step. Brutality was predictable in its unpredictability. At nightfall, a second roll call ended the day. This ritual, carried out with exhausted bodies and troubled minds, could last hours if the numbers did not match or if a prisoner failed to return. Silence was absolute. The light of the spotlights illuminated emaciated faces trying to remain upright despite trembling. Back in the barracks, prisoners could finally lie down. Some spoke quietly about their families, others cried silently. Most simply closed their eyes to avoid thinking. Sleep was fragmented and terrifying. Any noise could mean another nighttime inspection, another punishment, another unexpected roll call. By the late 1930s, these early camps had perfected a system of total degradation. Mass killing had not yet begun, but life was consumed day by day. Work, hunger, disease, fear, and violence formed a mechanism that transformed prisoners into exhausted bodies, ready for the next phase of the Nazi project. A system in which death would no longer be a consequence, but the main objective. And that shift, shaped by the absolute radicalization beginning in 1940, would manifest itself in the extermination camps. where the daily routine would no longer be a cycle of exhaustion, but a perfect choreography of death. From 1940 onward, when the Nazi project adopted extermination as explicit policy, the camps ceased to be places of punishment and became components of a machinery designed to eliminate entire lives in a matter of hours. Unlike the early concentration camps, where death came slowly through exhaustion or disease, the extermination camps functioned as final stations, places where a prisoner's day could last less than a sunrise. There, time collapsed into minutes between the train's arrival, the family separation, the final deception and death in the gas chambers. Daily dynamics in these camps had such cold precision that they seemed industrial. Everything began on the tracks. Trains arrived loaded with hundreds or thousands of deportees who had spent days locked inside cattle wagons without water or food. When the doors opened, guards shouted orders, dogs barked, prisoners stumbled trying to get out, and the platform became chaos filled with weakened bodies trying to orient themselves. The selection was the first act of the day. An SS doctor, with a simple gesture of the hand, sent some to the side of temporary forced labor and others to the path that led directly to death. This process lasted less than 10 seconds per person. No one asked for names, stories, or origins. It did not matter whether someone was a doctor, musician, rabbi, or child. The decision depended on immediate physical assessment. The elderly, women with babies, and the sick were almost always sent to the left, toward the gas chambers. For those selected to die, the day ended just as it began. They were taken to a building that appeared to be a bathhouse. Signs spoke of showers, disinfection, and clean clothing. Everything was calculated to avoid panic and maintain order. Prisoners left their belongings on numbered hooks, convinced they would retrieve them. They entered in large groups and were ordered to breathe deeply. The door closed. Minutes later, silence replaced the screams. The following process was just as meticulous. The Sonderkommandos, Jewish prisoners forced to work in the stages after death, removed the bodies, cut hair, extracted gold teeth, and moved the corpses to the crematoriums or to open pyres when the number of victims exceeded the oven's capacity. This work, done under threat of death, devastated those who performed it. Every day they saw hundreds of new bodies. Every day they knew the next group of Sonderkommandos would replace the previous one when it became unnecessary. For those selected to live a few more weeks, the day took on a different rhythm, though just as brutal. After the selection, they were taken into overcrowded barracks. Some worked immediately unloading trains, sorting belongings, cleaning remains, digging pits, or transporting materials. Others were sent to satellite labor camps. Work began early in the morning. There was no rest. Food, an even thinner soup than in forced labor camps, and a hard piece of bread was not enough to sustain a body under such strain. Malnutrition turned people into shadows. Their faces sank, ribs protruded, legs became unstable. Violence was constant. Guards beat prisoners for any reason. Internal selections, carried out periodically inside the camp to remove those no longer useful, spread terror. A prisoner could survive 3 days or 3 weeks. No one knew. Survival depended on less deadly work assignments, small acts of solidarity, leftover food, or simply luck. Nights were torment. The barracks filled with the sick, with groans and muffled cries. The smell of unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and humidity filled the air. Sleep was nearly impossible. Many feared closing their eyes and not waking up. Others feared waking in the middle of a new selection or an arbitrary execution. Darkness brought no relief. It brought uncertainty. In these camps, absolute degeneration was not a side effect, it was a goal. The Nazis designed every space to destroy bodies, minds, and human bonds. Death was so common that it no longer surprised. Everything was planned, so time passed like a repetitive cycle of work, hunger, beatings, fear, and death. From 1940 onward, this structure operated without pause. Trains arrived every day. Gas chambers operated every day. Crematoriums burned every day. The machinery stopped only when there was no fuel, when wind prevented the lighting of the pyres, or when a temporary uprising, such as an attack or a desperate escape attempt, caused a brief interruption. The tragedy was so vast that many survivors stated that time inside the camp could not be measured in days or weeks, but in states of exhaustion and moments between selections. Life was reduced to a single question: will I make it to the next sunrise? Jewish resistance. In the ghettos, in the forests, in the extermination camps, and even in the convoys heading toward death, Jewish resistance emerged as a complex, multifaceted, and profoundly human expression. It was not only about armed uprisings, though these existed, extraordinary and heroic, but also about cultural, spiritual, documentary, and clandestine resistance. In a world designed for their destruction, every act of affirmation, every preserved word, every hidden child, and every improvised weapon constituted a direct challenge to the Nazi project. Jewish resistance did not arise from the hope of military victory, but from the conviction that even when everything seemed lost, dignity should not be surrendered without a fight. Among all forms of resistance, the most emblematic was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943. There, after months of mass deportations to Treblinka, a group of young, poorly armed fighters decided that the next transport would be met with force. The Jewish Combat Organization, also known as JOB, and the GDW, the Jewish Military Union, gathered improvised weapons. Scarce pistols, homemade bombs, incendiary bottles made in clandestine basements. They knew they could not defeat the German army, but they also knew that allowing liquidation without resistance would mean accepting their fate without leaving testimony. When German troops entered the ghetto on April 19th, they expected a routine deportation. Instead, they encountered gunfire from rooftops, ambushes in alleyways, and snipers hidden behind shattered windows. The first hours took the Germans by surprise, forcing them to retreat. For nearly a month, despite the absolute imbalance of forces, Jewish fighters resisted among ruins and tunnels. Building by building, the SS set entire blocks on fire to drive them out. Mordecai Anielewicz, the leader of the JOB, wrote in his final letter that they had fulfilled the dream of Jewish youth, that resistance is possible. When the ghetto had been reduced to ashes, their struggle had already become a symbol of human resistance in the face of extermination. Another extraordinary uprising took place in Sobibor, a camp designed solely for killing. There, in October 1943, a group of prisoners led by Alexander Pechersky, a Jewish Soviet officer, organized a bold rebellion. They killed several SS officers through deception and ambushes, disarmed guards, cut communication lines, and caused chaos that allowed around 300 prisoners to escape into the forests. Most were later captured, but dozens survived the war. Their success led the Nazis to close Sobibor and destroy it to erase all traces of the uprising. In Treblinka, another group of Sonderkommando prisoners organized a revolt in August 1943. They stole weapons, set facilities on fire, and attacked the guards. About 200 prisoners managed to escape. Roughly 70 survived the war. The uprising demonstrated that even in a place designed to annihilate people within hours, clandestine organization could challenge brutality. Resistance also took silent but profound forms. In the Vilna ghetto, clandestine cultural groups organized readings, plays, and philosophical debates as a way to preserve identity in the face of total dispossession. The FPO, the United Partisan Organization, operated in secret, creating communication networks and hiding places, attempting to acquire weapons and organize guerrilla units that could flee to the forests. Their motto, "Let us not be led like sheep to the slaughter," became a cry of dignity throughout Eastern Europe. Clandestine archives were another crucial form of resistance. In Warsaw, the Oneg Shabbat group, led by Emanuel Ringelblum, meticulously documented life in the ghetto: diaries, photographs, reports, recipes, farewell letters, children's drawings. Everything was buried in metal boxes and milk cans with the hope that one day someone would find it. After the war, part of the archive was recovered and became an incomparable testimony to the Jewish experience under Nazism. In the forests of Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, groups of Jewish partisans emerged, many formed by people who had escaped from ghettos or transports. Some groups acted independently, others joined Soviet units. The Bielski family, for example, built a secret camp in the Naliboki forest where they rescued more than 1,200 Jews, creating a self-sufficient enclave with workshops, improvised schools, and security systems. They fought, sabotaged railway lines, and resisted constant attacks. Resistance also manifested in small but courageous acts inside the camps. Prisoners who hid children during selections, women who stole gunpowder from German factories, doctors who used their positions to save lives, workers who sabotaged machinery or produced defective tools. In Auschwitz, a group of women, Rosa Robota, Alla Gertner, Estusia Weichblum and Regina Saphirstein, managed to smuggle gunpowder out of the munitions factory and deliver it to the Sonderkommandos for the October 1944 uprising, when they succeeded in destroying one of the crematoria before being executed. There was also spiritual resistance, prayers whispered in secret, clandestine celebrations of religious holidays, children taught in their traditions, rabbis who continued teaching in whispers. These gestures, invisible to the guards, were a reminder that Judaism would not be erased entirely. Each of these forms of resistance, from improvised weapons to the act of sharing the last piece of bread, revealed the same truth. When the world collapsed, many Jews refused to accept death as the only possible answer. They resisted because it was the only way to affirm that even within hell, their humanity persisted. But as the war advanced and the Nazi machinery began to show cracks, another decisive stage was approaching. From the east, armies no one expected liberated the first camps and, with them, revealed to the world what had taken place behind the electrified fences. The liberation of the camps. The dawn of July 27, 1944, arrived with a rumor that swept through Majdanek like a strange wind. Prisoners heard distant explosions, confused orders, and the hurried sound of engines that did not belong to the guards. Minutes later, Soviet soldiers crossed the fences. They did not fire. There was no need. The camp, partially evacuated and hastily destroyed by the SS, fell silent. The liberation of the first major extermination camp was not a heroic act, but a discovery. The Soviets did not know what they were going to find, and the prisoners could not imagine they were about to see the outside world again. The scene was bewildering. The soldiers walked between empty barracks, mountains of shoes, piles of charred bones, and warehouses filled with stolen belongings. The smell of death permeated every corner. Some prisoners, too weak to stand, looked at the liberators with distrust. They had seen so many uniforms and heard so many promises that they did not know whether to believe in salvation. Others, recognizing they were not Germans, cried without sound, as if their voice had been erased in the camp. Those who could still walk dragged themselves toward the soldiers and embraced them without understanding what was happening. Majdanek was the first camp liberated, but not the last. As the Red Army advanced from the east and the Allies from the west, the camps began to fall one after another. However, liberation did not mean an immediate end to suffering. In many places, the Nazis tried to erase the evidence. They destroyed crematoria, burned documents, and forced prisoners on long death marches into the interior of Germany. Thousands died along the way, shot, frozen, or exhausted. Even so, some camps were found practically intact. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, liberated on January 27, 1945, the Soviets entered a place that seemed frozen in time. The buildings still stood. The electrified fences still crackled, the gas chambers were damaged but intact, and the warehouses overflowed with mountains of suitcases, toys, eyeglasses, and bundles of human hair packed in industrial sacks. The surviving prisoners, about 7,000 who had been too sick or too weak to be evacuated, wandered like shadows through the snow. Many did not understand they were free. Approaching the soldiers and saying, "Ich bin Jude," meaning "I am Jewish," was an act filled with fear. For years, that phrase had meant a death sentence. The first emotional impact on the liberators was as deep as it was disconcerting. No Soviet, American, or British soldier had ever seen anything like it. It was not only the number of bodies, but the entire system. The architecture designed for killing, the industrial efficiency applied to extermination, the unimaginable scale of the crime. The soldiers tried to offer food to the survivors, but many died after eating it. Their bodies, devastated by starvation, could not process heavy food suddenly. Doctors improvised care, but the magnitude of the physical damage was immense. In Buchenwald, liberated by the Americans in April 1945, survivors lined up before the correspondents' cameras, displaying skeletal bodies that would become some of the first photographic evidence of the Holocaust. In Bergen-Belsen, the British entered on April 15th into a hell of piled corpses, typhus-infested barracks, and prisoners barely able to lift their heads. There they found Anne Frank dead just weeks earlier, and thousands who could no longer speak, recognize faces, or remember their names. The scene was so infernal that many soldiers vomited upon entering, others cried openly. The process of medical care was desperate. Medical teams improvised field hospitals, distributed food in small rations, and began treatments for typhus and other diseases. But for many survivors, liberation came too late. In Bergen-Belsen, more than 13,000 died after being freed, unable to recover from the extreme conditions of the camp. Even so, doctors and nurses did everything possible, working day and night among bodies that could not be removed quickly enough. Emotional shock also struck survivors. Some searched frantically for relatives who would never return. Others wandered aimlessly, unable to process freedom. Some clung to Allied uniforms as if they were lifelines. Others broke down when they understood that their world, homes, families, cities had vanished forever. For many, liberation meant a new kind of loneliness. The reaction of the liberators evolved quickly. After the initial horror, they understood the importance of documenting everything: photographs, films, reports. The Allies knew that without this forceful evidence, the world would not believe the scale of the crime. The images spread through newspapers, newsreels, and military archives, shaking international consciousness. For the first time, the world saw the traces of genocide not as rumors, but as irrefutable reality. After liberation, survivors were transferred to displaced persons camps, where they waited for news of their families or sought ways to start a new life from scratch. Some returned to their hometowns to find their homes occupied or destroyed. Others emigrated to Palestine, the United States, or Latin America, carrying physical and emotional scars that would accompany them forever. Liberation did not erase the past, but it opened a path toward reconstruction. Even so, in 1945, millions around the world still did not fully understand what had happened. It would take the Nuremberg trials, testimonies, recovered archives, and the voices of the survivors to reveal the full magnitude of the crime. But in those first days, when soldiers crossed the gates and found emaciated faces trying to smile, the message was simple and profound. The machinery of death had ended, and with it began the struggle to understand, remember, and rebuild.